Film is a form of art. In fact, it is one of the most important forms of art. Maybe today you don't realize it, but film can and does transcend simple entertainment. It can tell stories about the human condition and what it means to be human. You could view it as just entertainment, which a lot of movies are just for entertainment's sake. To me, it is the grandest form of art, since it incorporates both visual and auditory. But film wasn't viewed as an art form then, and could be subjected to censorship. Society was a lot more serious with taboo subjects portrayed in media. Censorship was allowed to happen in the film industry because it was not protected by the First Amendment, and film challenged people at the time. Film censorship goes all the way back to the creation of the format of film itself. The motion picture was invented by the Lumiere brothers all the way back in 1895 in Paris, France. Not even 2 years later did the first case of films being censored happen. In Maine in 1897, prize fight films became a subject of censorship, as they were prevented from being screened due to the sport of boxing being banned. Later, in 1907, as films began to take off, the first censorship law was in place in Chicago, Illinois. Film was still a very new format of entertainment, and everyone was unsure of what could be shown in the movie. If a film exhibitor screened any film that didn't have a permit of approval by the police chief, then the film would be cut or removed from screening. Soon after, many other cities around the country began to enforce their own censorship laws. 2 years later, in 1909, the New York City government would receive various complaints of inappropriate or controversial films being screened. As a result, the National Board of Motion Picture Censorship, or National Board of Review, was founded, the first censorship board in America. For any film to be screened in the city, filmmakers would have to submit their own film to the board to be approved. The board could cut or destroy any footage from the film being submitted to them. 2 years later, in 1911, the first statewide censor was put in place for the state of Pennsylvania, since there are too many quote-unquote indecent films being screened. State censors could arrest anyone who screened an unapproved film. In 1915, the film conglomerate Mutual Film Corporation took to a lawsuit against Ohio's censorship board, arguing that films should be subjected as free speech and not subjected to censorship in the case of Mutual Film Corporation v. Industrial Commission of Ohio. The Industrial Commission of Ohio won, and film was deemed purely as a business and not as a form of art, thus not being protected by the First Amendment. The Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, later the Motion Picture Association, was founded by William H. Hayes in 1922 to improve the image of the film industry and for the industry to establish a clean moral tone. Hayes advocated against censorship in movies. Though there was no nation board of censors for the whole country, but state censors would cut movies due to portrayals of violence and sexuality, leading to movies being severely cut. This led to unhappy moviegoers since movies began to be incoherent due to many scenes being cut. Hayes tried to combat censorship issues by instituting the formula, in which filmmakers would have to send synopses to the MPBDA for approval. But this failed along with the code of the don'ts and be carefuls, since studios didn't bother with them. Before the Hayes Code was established in the late 1920s up until the mid-1930s, there was a time in the film industry called pre-Code Hollywood. This was a time in which films had more graphic content with increased violence, sexuality, profanity, and anti-heroes. All things Hayes didn't want in excessive amounts in the industry. This was a time when America faced the Great Depression and there was no major regulation in the film industry, and state and local censors couldn't control what films were being made or what could be in the films, only how they were allowed to be screened in their local areas or states. This was put to an end by the Hays Code, or the Protection Code, which was established in 1930, but wasn't firmly put in place until 1934. This was to prevent government regulation on the industry and to set the industry's own regulations. This was like the don'ts and be carefuls, because there were rules in what couldn't be shown in a film and what to be careful to include. But this time, it was backed and supported by studio executives, so it had to be followed by the industry. The Hays Code was now the rules the industry had to follow by, but Hays had a very big responsibility since he put in place what could be shown or not be shown in films. Films became less per se graphic in nature, but became more morally clean. The Hays Code limited artistic freedom, and filmmakers had to follow a more conservative approach to the art of filmmaking. Filmmakers could no longer create completely free and had to be subjected to censorship. Though it is the responsibility of the filmmaker to make the film, this prevented violent, sex, and more graphic themes that are part of the everyday world to be excluded, limiting artistic expression. The period of censorship by the Production Code lasted until a fateful decision in 1952. Joseph Burstein v. Wilson was a trial over the film L'amore, an Italian anthology film directed by Roberto Rossellini. Specifically, the short The Miracle was deemed sacrilegious, thus not being able to be screened in New York. The distributor, Joseph Burstein, took this to trial, and the verdict was 9-0 in Joseph Burstein's favor. This was the Miracle decision, in which film was deemed as an art form, now being protected by the First Amendment nationally. The Miracle decision ended most censorship power from the Hays Code. The industry was hesitant to abolish the code due to potentially receiving backlash from the public. This left studios still worried about releasing films that were deemed too controversial. All power of the Hays Code ended in 1968 with the establishment of the MPAA rating system by the Motion Picture Association of America, or the Motion Picture Association. The MPAA rating was separated into 5 tiers: G, PG, PG-13, R, and NC-17. G standard for general audiences, anyone was allowed. PG standard for parental guidance suggested. The PG-13 meant for parents strongly cautioned and may be inappropriate for anyone under 13. R meant required parental guidance for anyone who was under 17. And NC-17 meant no one under 18 was allowed in. The MPAA rating system still applies to today. The film industry now had no limits or censors to limit artistic freedom and expression. Overall, thankfully, film censorship is no longer existent in the United States of America, though the NC-17 rating does prohibit films being shown in most theaters, which is a sort of modern form of censorship, but rarely is there films ever receiving that rating. Though it is the right of the filmmaker to make any film they want, it is the responsibility of the filmmaker to do what is just in their creativity.